Somewhere beneath the crooked cobblestones of Diagon Alley, past the marble columns and the suspicious glares of creatures who have been counting gold since before your great-great-grandmother learned to walk, there exists a vault that most wizards pretend does not concern them. And you, settling into this quiet evening, are about to descend into its every secret. You feel the familiar lurch as the Gringotts cart begins its plunge, the air growing colder with each passing second, the torchlight becoming something more amber, more ancient, more reluctant to illuminate what lies ahead. The goblins operating this particular route do not make small talk, which is probably for the best because what would you even discuss? The weather several hundred feet underground tends to remain consistently, oppressively damp, with a chance of curses. The Black Family Vault sits at a depth reserved for clients whose gold predates the bank itself, a level where the tracks twist in patterns designed less for efficiency and more for discouraging anyone foolish enough to attempt the journey uninvited. You notice the cart slowing, the wheels screaming against rails that haven't been properly oiled since, one imagines, the goblins decided that the sound of metal shrieking added to the atmosphere. The historical reality of underground vaults stretches back to ancient Rome, where the Temple of Saturn served as the state treasury, its subterranean chambers protected by religious taboo rather than dragon fire, though one suspects dragons would have been more reliable. There exists an open scholarly debate about whether Gringotts founders borrowed their architectural philosophy from these classical models, or developed their tunneling techniques independently from dwarven mining traditions. A quirky footnote in goblin metallurgical history suggests that the first vault doors were actually repurposed cauldron bottoms, an origin story the goblins would very much prefer you forget. You grip the cart's edge as it rounds the final corner, and there, emerging from the gloom like a mouth waiting to speak secrets it has held for centuries, stands the entrance to Vault 711, the Black family's personal monument to wealth, paranoia, and the particular brand of dysfunction that comes from 12 generations of caring far too much about bloodlines. You step from the cart onto stone that has been worn smooth by footsteps spanning nearly a millennium, and the vault door before you presents itself like a challenge wrapped in enchantment, wrapped in the general aesthetic of, we really don't want you here. The door itself bears no visible lock, no handle, no obvious mechanism for entry, because the Blacks apparently believed that convenience was for lesser families who hadn't spent centuries accumulating enemies. A goblin approaches the door and does something complicated with his long fingers, a gesture that exists somewhere between a greeting and a threat, and the metal begins to ripple. The medieval practice of blood-sealed documents where important contracts were literally signed in the signer's blood to ensure magical binding provides the historical foundation for what happens next. The vault recognizes bloodline through methods that make modern security systems look like leaving your key under the doormat. Some scholars debate whether this blood magic constitutes a form of sentient enchantment or merely an extremely sophisticated pattern recognition spell. A question that probably matters less when you're standing before a door that could theoretically dissolve your bones if it decides you don't belong. A lesser-known historical oddity suggests that one medieval Black ancestor attempted to key the vault to recognize pure intentions rather than pure blood, an experiment that lasted approximately 3 hours before the family realized that none of them could get in. You watch the door iris open, the metal folding away in patterns that shouldn't be geometrically possible, revealing the interior darkness beyond. The air that escapes carries the scent of old gold, older magic, and something that might generously be called ancestral mustiness. Essentially the smell of money that has been sitting in the dark, judging you for several hundred years. You step inside, and the vault awakens around you, artifacts beginning to emit their faint glows, their subtle hums, their general aura of, please touch us, we definitely won't curse you immediately. The goblins do not follow. They wait outside with expressions that suggest they have seen what happens to unauthorized visitors and found the spectacle only mildly entertaining. The interior of Vault 711 sprawls before you, like a museum curated by someone with unlimited funds, questionable ethics, and an absolute certainty that their aesthetic preferences should never be questioned. And as your eyes adjust to the particular quality of light that ancient gold produces, warm but somehow unwelcoming, you begin to understand that the Black family fortune was not simply accumulated, but rather constructed, layer by deliberate layer, over centuries of calculated acquisition. You walk past shelves lined with galleons minted during the reign of every notable wizarding leader since the formal establishment of the ministry. Coins so old that the faces stamped upon them have worn smooth into golden anonymity, their value now residing not in their purchasing power but in their sheer historical weight. The origins of this fortune trace back to the mid-13th century, a period when the family first appears in documented wizarding records as minor landholders in what is now northeastern England. Their social climbing beginning with the marriage of Phineas Black to a witch whose dowry included 3 substantial properties, and, according to family legend, a moderately unpleasant disposition. Historical records from this era, and here we touch upon mainstream medieval history, confirm that the 13th century saw the formalization of European banking systems, with institutions like the Knights Templar establishing international financial networks that would later influence both Muggle and magical economies. The Blacks, ever opportunistic, apparently recognized early that gold breeds more gold, and they invested in ventures that their descendants would later describe in deliberately vague terms. Investments in continental interests and northern enterprises that probably meant exactly what you suspect they meant. A fringe historical theory proposed by a wizarding genealogist who was subsequently banned from several archives suggests that the early Black fortune actually derived from a successful dragon egg smuggling operation between Norway and the Mediterranean, a claim that the family has neither confirmed nor denied across 7 centuries of aggressive legal action. You notice among the older coins some that bear no wizarding markings at all. Muggle currency from medieval kingdoms, Byzants and florins and silver pennies that the Blacks apparently acquired during a period of history that scholars continue to debate. Did wizarding families actively participate in Muggle commerce during the pre-statute era? Or did they simply take what they wanted through magical means and construct elaborate paper trails afterward? The joke, of course, is that the Blacks would have found either method acceptable as long as the gold ended up in their vault, and you suspect that moral flexibility has always been a family trait, passed down like the dark hair and the unfortunate tendency toward dramatic pronouncements. You run your fingers along a shelf containing rings, dozens of signet rings bearing the family crest, each representing a generation that wore the symbol with pride before passing it to the next, and you cannot help but wonder how many of these were removed from hands that had grown cold. Hands that had perhaps grown cold, under circumstances the family preferred not to record. The vault stretches deeper than should be physically possible, an architectural impossibility that you attribute to extension charms layered so thickly that the space has essentially given up on following the rules of conventional geometry. And as you walk further in, you notice that the artifacts become progressively older, the gold becomes progressively more tarnished, the sense of accumulated history becomes progressively more oppressive. Like reading a family album backward, watching the faces become less familiar, the clothing more archaic, the expressions more stern. A lesser-known quirk of medieval wizarding banking involved the practice of gold singing, wherein vault contents were cataloged through a musical spell that assigned each item a unique tone, creating a symphony of wealth that theoretically made auditing easier, but practically just gave rich families an excuse to brag about how their vault sounded more harmonious than their neighbors. You smile at the thought of generations of Blacks standing in this very space, listening to their fortune sing, convinced that the particular melody of their accumulated wealth proved something about their inherent superiority, when really it just proved that they had a lot of stuff and insufficient hobbies. The deepest shelves contain items that predate even the family's formal rise to prominence. Acquisitions from the so-called wandering years when Black ancestors traveled Europe in search of artifacts, knowledge, and one suspects, elaborate justifications for taking things that belong to other people. The cursed heirlooms begin approximately 30 paces into the vault, past the merely valuable and into the territory of the genuinely dangerous. And you find yourself walking more carefully now, your footsteps softer, your breathing slower, as though the objects themselves might wake if you disturb their ancient slumber. You pause before a cabinet made of wood so dark it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, its glass doors revealing rows of jewelry that would make any museum curator simultaneously covetous and terrified. Necklaces, bracelets, tiaras, and brooches, each one beautiful in the way that certain poisonous flowers are beautiful. which is to say beautiful in a manner that strongly suggests you should not touch them under any circumstances. The Black family's collection of cursed artifacts represents one of the most extensive private holdings in the wizarding world, a dubious distinction that they apparently pursued with the same enthusiasm other families might apply to collecting rare books or commemorative plates. Historical context proves illuminating here. The medieval and early modern periods saw widespread European belief in cursed objects, with mainstream historical records documenting numerous instances of supposedly hexed items being destroyed, sold, or hidden by families who feared their influence. The Blacks, characteristically, chose to collect rather than destroy, viewing dangerous objects as status symbols rather than liabilities. You notice a hand, severed and preserved, sitting on a velvet cushion as though it were a particularly distinguished trophy. This is almost certainly a hand of glory, an artifact whose creation process you prefer not to contemplate. Its utility in the dark arts balanced against its fundamental grotesqueness, in a moral equation that the Blacks apparently solved by simply not caring about morality. A quirky historical footnote: hands of glory appear in both wizarding and Muggle folklore, with Muggle traditions holding that a hanged man's hand, properly preserved and fitted with candles, could unlock any door and render its bearer invisible. The wizarding version skips most of the Muggle superstition and just works, which is somehow more unsettling. Scholars continue to debate whether the Black collection includes items that were cursed at the time of acquisition, or whether certain pieces were enchanted by family members themselves, a question that probably says more about the general Black approach to heirloom creation than anyone wants to acknowledge. You move to another shelf and find what appears to be a music box, its surface decorated with images of dancing figures whose movements seem to continue even when you're not directly observing them. You choose not to wind it, having encountered enough possessed musical objects in your studies to know that whatever tune this plays, it's not going to be enjoyable. The family's documentation of their cursed collection. What little survives includes notations in a variety of handwriting styles, spanning several centuries. Comments like, "do not wear in moonlight," "feeds on anger," and the particularly ominous, "has not killed anyone since 1847, intentionally." You allow yourself a soft laugh at the final notation. Whoever wrote that clearly understood humor, even if their humor was deeply, deeply concerning. And you move past a mirror that you deliberately avoid looking into, having no particular desire to see whatever reflection it might choose to show you. The mainstream historical practice of commissioning protective amulets, documented extensively in medieval European sources, finds its dark inversion in this collection. Rather than protection, these objects were designed to project harm, to curse enemies, to guarantee that slights against the Black family were repaid with interest that compounded across generations. A particularly elaborate necklace catches your attention, its opals glowing with an inner fire that seems too active, too aware, and you recall reading about this piece. It allegedly killed 3 Muggle-born witches in the 19th century, each time returning to the vault through means that were never fully explained, as though it simply wanted to be here, among its kindred objects, waiting for its next opportunity. The joke among curse breakers you've heard is that the Black Vault doesn't need guards because the contents guard themselves. And like most jokes about dangerous magic, it's funny right up until the moment you realize it's completely accurate. You step back from the shelves of jewelry and find yourself facing a collection of weapons, blades and wands and implements whose purposes you can only guess at, each one maintained in perfect condition despite centuries of storage, ready at any moment to fulfill whatever dark function their creators intended. You round a corner in the vault and stop abruptly, your attention captured by a display case that sits alone upon a pedestal, its isolation from the surrounding treasures suggesting an importance that transcends mere monetary value. And as you approach, you realize that you are looking at one of the most consequential objects in modern wizarding history. Though at this moment in the timeline of the vault's existence, no one yet understands just how consequential it will become. The locket rests on faded green velvet, its heavy gold chain coiled around it like a sleeping serpent, its face marked with an elaborate S fashioned from emerald chips that catch the light and throw it back in a way that seems almost defensive, almost territorial. This is Salazar Slytherin's locket, an artifact that traces its provenance back nearly 1,000 years to the founding of Hogwarts itself, to a wizard whose opinions about blood purity would find their fullest expression in the family that eventually came to possess his most treasured jewelry. The historical reality of founder artifacts, items genuinely connected to the four Hogwarts founders, represents one of mainstream wizarding history's most documented phenomena. While many claims to founder connections have proven fraudulent, certain objects have been verified through magical means that scholars widely accept as reliable, if not fully understood. The locket's journey to this vault constitutes a story of its own. It passed from Slytherin to his descendants, eventually reaching the Gaunt family, who guarded it with the desperate intensity of people who possessed nothing else of value. Their pride in their bloodline matched only by their poverty and their profound unpleasantness. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. It seems fitting, somehow, that a story about ancient treasure and family legacy should reach across modern borders, connecting listeners in Seoul to listeners in Sao Paulo, in Cairo to listeners in Calgary. All of you settling into your evening while contemplating the strange paths that valuable objects travel across centuries of human ambition. The locket entered Black possession through marriage. A Gaunt daughter wed into a Black cadet branch, bringing with her this singular treasure and presumably the family temperament that made Gaunts such delightful dinner companions. And there it remained. Catalog number 7-11-382B, until circumstances would bring it to far more dangerous hands. A quirky historical oddity, the locket was apparently worn to at least 3 Black family weddings over the centuries, each time by a bride who believed that Slytherin's favor would ensure a successful union, and each time the marriage ended in circumstances that ranged from unfortunate to genuinely should have seen that coming. You lean closer to the case, studying the locket's surface, and you cannot help but notice that the S seems to move very slightly. A trick of the light that probably isn't a trick of the light at all, a suggestion of the consciousness that will later be revealed to reside within this deceptively beautiful object. The scholarly debate around founder artifacts centers on the question of sentience. Do objects of sufficient age and magical significance develop a form of awareness, or do they merely absorb and reflect the intentions of those who handle them? The locket offers no answers, only that subtle gleam, that sense of being watched even as you do the watching. You step back and consider the irony. Here sits an object worth more than the rest of the vault combined, judged by historical significance rather than gold weight. And yet for centuries it was simply one treasure among many, catalogued and shelved, and occasionally dusted by house elves who had no idea that they were maintaining what would become a vessel for the darkest magic their world would ever know. The joke, such as it is, involves a Black family ancestor who reportedly tried to sell the locket during a financial downturn in the 1780s. No buyer could be found because, as the ancestor complained in surviving letters, no one appreciates genuine historical value anymore. They only want shiny new things without proper provenance. That ancestor, who considered the locket merely pretty rather than significant, who saw it as liquid assets rather than liquid evil, would probably be horrified to learn its eventual fate. Or perhaps, given Black family tendencies, he would be perversely proud that something from their vault caused so much chaos. You take one final look at the locket before moving on, knowing that its story has many chapters still to come, chapters involving a Dark Lord, a cave, a house elf, and a teenager with exceptional luck. But that is a tale for another portion of this journey through the vault's secrets. The tapestry does not reside in the vault itself. It hangs in the ancestral home, at number 12 Grimmauld Place. But you find its documentation here, and as you page through the preserved records, you understand that the burnt names tell a story as complete as any officially maintained family history. Perhaps more complete because destruction itself is a form of honesty about what a family cannot tolerate. You hold pages of parchment that detail the tapestry's creation in the late 16th century, commissioned by a Black patriarch who wanted something more permanent than oral tradition, more visual than written records, more impressive than the modest family trees maintained by lesser wizarding households. The mainstream historical practice of creating elaborate genealogical tapestries reached its height in Renaissance Europe, where noble families commissioned works that trace their ancestry back to Trojan heroes, Roman emperors, and occasionally figures from biblical mythology, claims that were almost uniformly fictional but served the essential purpose of making everyone feel important. The black tapestry, by contrast, limited itself to verifiable ancestors, a restraint that suggests either unusual honesty or an understanding that their actual history was impressive enough without invented progenitors. When your family has genuinely produced ministers for magic and Hogwarts headmasters, you don't need to pretend that Aeneas was your great-great-grandfather. You examine the records of burnt names, each removal documented with the precision of a legal proceeding. Marius Black, struck from the tapestry in 1932 for the crime of being born without magical ability. A squib whose existence embarrassed a family that equated magic with worth. Andromeda Black, removed in 1971 after her marriage to Ted Tonks, a muggle-born wizard whose love apparently weighed less, in Black estimation, than the purity of his bloodline. Sirius Black, whose burn mark appeared in 1976, following his refusal to embrace family values, and his subsequent sorting into Gryffindor, which some family members apparently considered a capital offense. The documentation includes small notes in various handwriting styles, observations about the banished individuals that range from coldly factual, married beneath station, 3 children, to genuinely vitriolic, dead to the family as he soon will be to everyone else, one hopes. Offering insight into the emotional temperature of these excommunications. A quirky historical footnote. The spell used to burn names from the tapestry was specifically developed for this purpose by a black family ancestor who, ironically, would himself be burned from the tapestry 2 generations later, for reasons the records declined to specify, presumably because the irony was too painful to document. You smile at this cosmic justice, or perhaps cosmic joke, imagining the ancestor perfecting his removal spell with no idea that it would eventually be turned against his own memory. There's a lesson in that, about building weapons, though it's clearly a lesson that the blacks never learned. Scholars continue to debate the psychological impact of these erasures on both the erased and the remaining family members, with some arguing that the practice reinforced family cohesion through shared exclusion, while others suggest that it created a climate of fear that ultimately contributed to the family's decline. Everyone knowing that any deviation from expected behavior could result not merely in punishment, but in complete historical negation. The records show that certain burnt names have been quietly restored over the centuries, sometimes within decades of the original removal, suggesting that the family's concept of unforgivable was somewhat flexible depending on changed circumstances, inheritance considerations, or the simple death of whoever had been most offended by the original transgression. You find a detailed illustration of the tapestry itself, drawn before several significant burnings, and you study the faces of those who would later be removed. They look no different from those who remained. No mark of future shame visible in their embroidered features, their fate determined not by anything inherent but by choices they had not yet made. Choices that would prove incompatible with family expectations. The second joke among those who study black family history involves the burned names. Collectively, the erased members of the family accomplished more good in the wizarding world than all the remaining names combined, which probably says something profound about what the blacks valued and what they should have valued. You set down the documentation and consider the tapestry's role as an instrument of control, a visual reminder that belonging was conditional, that the family's embrace could become the family's rejection in the time it took to light a wand and speak an incantation. What a strange thing to hang on your wall, this monument to love's limits, this artistic representation of the precise boundaries of acceptance. The historical records you've examined also document several petitions for restoration, letters from erased family members or their descendants requesting that their names be rewoven into the fabric, and the responses, when responses exist at all, range from cold rejections to negotiations involving financial settlements, suggesting that even exile had its price. That return was possible for those willing to pay in gold or pride. You descend deeper into the vault, past the family records and the cursed jewelry, past the founder artifacts and the documented removals, into a section where the air itself feels different, heavier somehow, charged with protections that predate the goblins' involvement, and speak to a more primal understanding of how to guard what matters most. You notice that the walls here are not precisely stone. They appear to be stone, They feel like stone. But when you look closely, you see patterns in their surface that suggest something organic, something grown rather than carved. And you recall the obscure magical tradition of geomantic vault construction, where the building itself is cultivated from enchanted minerals over centuries of careful tending. The mainstream historical record confirms that ancient Egyptian tombs employed elaborate protective measures beyond simple physical barriers, including curses inscribed in hieroglyphics that threatened horrible fates for grave robbers. A tradition that Wizarding Society adapted and amplified, creating protections that could actually deliver on those threats rather than merely articulating them. The Blacks apparently invested heavily in these deeper protections, layers of security that even Gringotts goblins could not entirely understand or control. And you suspect that this is precisely why the family chose this particular institution, a vault within a vault, where goblin protection served as the outer shell while family magic guarded the true treasures. You pass what appears to be a section of floor that shifts color as you walk across it, testing something about you that you cannot identify, apparently finding you acceptable enough to allow passage. And you try not to think too hard about what happens to those it finds unacceptable, because that thought leads to dark places. A quirky historical oddity. There exists an unpublished manuscript, held in a private collection, that describes the Blacks commissioning a dragonfire reinforcement of their vault's inner walls sometime in the 15th century. A process that allegedly required 3 Hungarian horntails and the full cooperation of Gringotts staff. Cooperation that was purchased at a price the manuscript describes only as sufficient. You grin at the understatement. Goblin cooperation has never come cheaply, and one can only imagine what sufficient meant to a family with the Blacks' resources and negotiating strategies, which probably involved equal parts gold and veiled threats about what might happen if cooperation was not forthcoming. The scholarly debate about dragonfire protections centers on whether the flames create a genuine barrier against magical intrusion, or simply add a layer of psychological intimidation, a question that most curse breakers are understandably reluctant to test empirically. When the penalty for being wrong is immolation, theoretical knowledge suddenly seems sufficient. You examine the walls more closely and notice runes carved into their surface, symbols from magical traditions that span multiple cultures and historical periods, suggesting that the Blacks drew upon every available source when designing their protections. A pragmatism that sits oddly with their famous blood prejudice, but then again, hypocrisy has never been an impediment to effective security. The deeper protections include what appears to be a threshold curse, an enchantment that activates if anyone crosses a particular boundary with hostile intent, and you step carefully, keeping your mind focused on historical curiosity rather than theft, just in case the boundary cannot distinguish between actual and imagined hostility. The joke among Gringotts employees, according to accounts from those willing to discuss such matters, involves the Black Vault specifically. The goblins guard the entrance, the dragons guard the passage, and the vault guards itself. We just stand around looking intimidating because someone has to. You appreciate the humor while simultaneously recognizing its accuracy, because the deeper you travel into this space, the more you understand that the family's true treasures were never protected by external forces, but by magic, woven into the very concept of the vault itself. Magic that understands ownership at a level beyond legal documentation, that recognizes inheritance through blood rather than paperwork. The historical practice of blood wards, protections tied to family lineage, represents one of Wizarding Society's oldest magical traditions, documented in sources spanning from Babylonian curse tablets to medieval grimoires to modern ministry regulations, and the Blacks apparently mastered every variation, creating protections that would persist as long as any member of the bloodline survived. You pause at what appears to be the vault's deepest accessible point, a chamber within the chamber, its door marked with symbols that you recognize from various dark arts texts. Not a door that invites entry, but one that discourages even looking too closely, radiating an aura of wrongness that suggests whatever lies beyond belongs to a category of secret that perhaps should remain undiscovered. The wars came for the Black family as they came for all Wizarding Society. Two great conflagrations that reshaped the magical world and left their marks upon this vault in ways that you can trace through the accumulated objects before you, And as you walk among the relics of these conflicts, you understand that war makes collectors of everyone, whether they wish to collect or not. You stop before a display of wands, not the formal wands of living family members, but the final wands of the fallen, opponents defeated in duels or battles. Their instruments claimed as trophies in a tradition that predates recorded wizarding history and speaks to something primal about the nature of magical combat. The mainstream historical record confirms that wand-taking was common practice in medieval wizarding warfare, with victors claiming opponents' wands as proof of conquest and symbols of transferred power. A practice that ministry regulations now technically prohibit, but that continued informally well into the 20th century. The first wizarding war, Grindelwald's campaign for magical dominance in the 1930s and 1940s, appears in the Vault's collection through artifacts whose presence raises uncomfortable questions. Items bearing Durmstrang provenance, objects of Germanic magical tradition, pieces that might have been legitimately acquired before the war, or might have been taken during it, the documentation conspicuously absent or deliberately vague. The Blacks' position during the Grindelwald conflict remains, you note, a subject of scholarly debate, with some historians arguing that the family's blood purity ideology aligned them naturally with Grindelwald's goals, while others point to evidence of family members fighting against his forces. The truth probably involving the same complicated mixture of conviction, opportunism, and family disagreement that characterized most old families during this period. A quirky historical footnote. One Black family member apparently changed sides 3 times during the Grindelwald War, a flexibility that was either unprincipled or admirably pragmatic depending on one's perspective. And the vault contains objects from all 3 phases of his allegiance, suggesting that he collected souvenirs with equal enthusiasm, regardless of which banner he currently served. You find this darkly funny? Or perhaps just dark? Imagining this ancestor carefully cataloging his acquisitions, while bullets of very serious ideology flew overhead. His true loyalty perhaps reserved for the vault itself, rather than any abstract cause. The Second Wizarding War, Voldemort's rise and fall again, marked the vault more significantly, and you can see its effects in the shifting dates of deposits. A flurry of acquisitions in the early 1970s when the family backed what they assumed would be the winning side, a slowdown during Voldemort's first fall, a resumption in the late 1990s when the cause seemed resurgent, and then the final deposits of those who did not survive the Battle of Hogwarts. The vault contains items that were almost certainly confiscated from Muggle-born witches and wizards during the brief period of Death Eater Ministry control, objects whose rightful owners were sent to Azkaban or worse, their possessions distributed among loyal pureblood families as rewards for ideological commitment. You try not to touch these particular shelves, feeling that the grief attached to them might somehow transfer through contact. The mainstream historical reality of wartime looting finds its magical parallel here. Echoing the Nazi confiscation of Jewish property, the colonial extraction of indigenous artifacts, every instance where victors claimed the possessions of those they deemed inferior. The Blacks participated in this tradition with enthusiasm that their subsequent fates did not entirely justify. You notice gaps in the shelves, empty spaces where objects once rested, and the documentation suggests that certain items were removed not for use but for destruction. Evidence, apparently, of activities too dangerous to preserve even as family history, actions that someone decided were better erased than explained. The joke among post-war historians involves the Black Vault's eventual disposition. A family so obsessed with preserving their legacy ultimately left it to someone who would use their resources against everything they believed in, which either represents cosmic justice or cosmic irony depending on whether you believe the universe has a sense of humor. You examine a collection of photographs from the war years, images that move with the characteristic motion of wizarding photography, faces you recognize from historical accounts, some who died as heroes, some who died as villains, some whose moral positions remain genuinely ambiguous, all of them connected to this vault through blood or marriage, or the complicated negotiations of pureblood society. The scholarly debate about wartime complicity extends to the vault itself. Does possessing these objects implicate the current owner in historical crimes? Or does ownership create an obligation of preservation, a duty to maintain evidence of what occurred so that future generations cannot pretend ignorance? You come finally to understand what happened when Sirius Black died without direct heirs, How the accumulated weight of generations, the gold, the artifacts, the cursed heirlooms, the complicated documentation of who was burned and who was kept, transferred to someone the family would have considered unthinkable. And the irony of this transference illuminates something essential about the limitations of blood-based planning. The legal reality of wizarding inheritance, you have learned, operates on principles that blend primogeniture with magical recognition, meaning that wills can be contested, but bloodline magic typically provides the final determination of legitimate succession. And Sirius Black, for all his rebellion against family values, remained undeniably, inescapably, legally a Black. The mainstream historical practice of aristocratic succession, documented extensively in both Muggle and Wizarding records, typically included provisions against exactly this scenario. Clauses that would redirect inheritance away from unworthy heirs, trust that could be broken only by adherence to family standards, protections designed to ensure that accumulated wealth remained in ideologically aligned hands. The Blacks apparently believed their own protections sufficient, never imagining that a family member might both reject their values and survive long enough to inherit. A failure of imagination that perhaps reflects the broader failure of pure-blood ideology, which assumed that worthy heirs would always be available and that unworthy ones would be eliminated through natural selection or more active measures. Sirius's will directed everything to his godson, Harry Potter, a half-blood orphan whose mother was Muggle-born, whose life represented the antithesis of everything the Black family vault had been accumulated to preserve. And the vault, for all its protections, for all its ancient magic and blood-based wards, transferred as smoothly as if the family had intended this outcome all along. A quirky historical oddity, the house elf creature, bound to the Black family and therefore part of the inheritance, reportedly attempted to prevent the transfer through creative interpretation of his orders, hiding objects and misdirecting visitors, a one-elf resistance movement that ultimately proved as futile as the ideology it was attempting to preserve. You find this both sad and slightly amusing. Imagining the elderly house elf clutching family heirlooms to his chest, muttering about blood traitors and unworthy masters, his loyalty to a dead ideology outlasting the family that had instilled it. The scholarly debate about house elf autonomy intersects uncomfortably with the Black inheritance, raising questions about whether creatures' resistance represented genuine ideological conviction or merely magical compulsion manifesting as apparent belief. A distinction that matters enormously for house elf rights advocates and matters not at all to the house elf himself. The joke among ministry inheritance officials, according to those who remember the transfer, involves the sheer volume of paperwork generated. The Blacks spent centuries planning for every contingency except the one that actually happened, and we spent months sorting out the consequences of their failure. You smile at this, appreciating the fundamental humor of a family so obsessed with control, ultimately losing that control to the vagaries of affection. Sirius loved his godson, a simple emotional fact that no blood magic could counteract, and that love redirected 10 centuries of accumulation in a direction that would have horrified generations of carefully preserved ancestors. The vault's new owner, you understand, never particularly wanted the wealth, viewing it as a complicated gift from a complicated godfather who had himself been ambivalent about his inheritance. What do you do with treasure accumulated through means you find repugnant by people whose values you reject, consisting largely of objects you would never willingly use? The historical question of tainted inheritance extends far beyond this particular vault, touching on issues that Muggle society still grapples with. How do we handle wealth accumulated through exploitation? Artifacts stolen during colonial periods? Fortunes built on suffering that current owners did not personally cause, but continue to benefit from? You find no easy answers in the vault's shadows, only the objects themselves, still present, still valuable, still carrying their histories regardless of who currently possesses the legal title. And you understand that some questions perhaps cannot be resolved through inheritance law alone.
The torchlight dims gradually as you prepare to leave the vault, the flames somehow sensing that your exploration has reached its natural conclusion, and you find yourself walking more slowly now, your footsteps softer, your breathing deeper, as though the vault itself is settling into sleep alongside you. You pass the artifacts you examined earlier, The cursed jewelry, the documented burns, the locket that would later cause such chaos, and they seem quieter now, less insistent, their stories told, and therefore temporarily exhausted. The goblin's cart awaits you at the vault's entrance, the return journey promising to be as precipitous as the arrival. But for this moment, you linger at the threshold between the vault's accumulated darkness and the relative light of the tunnel beyond. The mainstream historical understanding of treasure, you reflect, has always centered on accumulation. More gold, more objects, more proof of success. But the Black Vault teaches a different lesson, one about the ultimate futility of possession, about how even the most carefully guarded collection eventually passes to hands its original gatherers would not have chosen. The scholarly debate about legacy extends to this quiet moment. Did the Blacks succeed in their centuries-long project, or did the very intensity of their efforts guarantee its eventual undoing? You suspect the answer lies somewhere in the middle, in the complicated space where all family histories ultimately reside. You take one last breath of the vault's ancient air, gold and dust, and something that might be memory, and you step out into the tunnel, the door irising closed behind you with a sound like a sigh. The cart begins its ascent, the tracks climbing through layers of stone and history, and you watch the deeper darkness recede below you, the secrets returning to their shadows, the vault resuming its patient wait for the next visitor, the next inheritor, the next chapter in a story that continues long after its original authors have departed. The air grows warmer as you rise, the torchlight brightening by degrees, and you feel the particular drowsiness that comes after intensive concentration, your mind pleasantly full, your body pleasantly tired, your thoughts drifting toward the surface even as the cart carries you there. The goblins who greet you at the upper levels seem neither surprised nor particularly interested in your return, their ancient faces carrying the same professional indifference they have shown every visitor for centuries, and you nod to them as you step back into the marble halls of Gringotts' public spaces. The afternoon light through the high windows seems impossibly bright after the vault's perpetual dusk, and you blink slowly, letting your eyes adjust, letting your breathing settle, letting the story you have witnessed begin its slow transformation from experience into memory. Outside, Diagon Alley continues its cheerful commerce, witches and wizards passing with packages and purpose, none of them particularly aware of the depths beneath their feet, the accumulated centuries of treasure and trouble sleeping in the darkness below. You walk among them feeling pleasantly separate, carrying secrets you will not share, knowledge that will settle into your dreams tonight like gold dust settling through still water. The story of the Black family vault, you understand, will never truly end. Inheritance continues, artifacts persist, questions remain unanswered. But for now, in this gentle evening, the tale has found its resting place. Your footsteps grow slower, your thoughts grow softer. The boundaries between waking and dreaming begin to blur like candlelight seen through closing eyes. The vault sleeps, the gold dreams its golden dreams. And you, dear listener, wherever in the world you find yourself tonight, may now do the same.